Colonialism in the Caribbean. Let's talk about it. Colonialism in the Caribbean started in the 15th century, mostly around 1493. And it was a result of Christopher Columbus landing in the area and claiming it for the Spanish. Now, the Spanish were mostly concentrating on conquering the Inca and the Aztec in South and Central America. But the Caribbean islands were very strategic for them to travel back and forth across the ocean. So the Caribbean really suffered a lot because of these travels back and forth and because of the conquest in South and Central America by the Spanish people. Now, as Spanish settlers started to move into the Caribbean more and more, a lot of the native people of the Caribbean got sick from European diseases, and many of them died. And because so many of them died, the Spanish decided to pull out. And this is when you have the French and the British starting to come into the area really heavily in the 1600s, like 1620s through 1630s. And they started to come into the area heavily. And with the start of the Atlantic slave trade, they started to bring in hundreds of thousands of Africans into the Caribbean to do the work, since so many of the native people had died from the diseases. And so the Caribbean islands really were the main focal point of slavery and really suffered a serious devastation dealing with slavery and the Africans being brought there from Africa. The Caribbean islands was the breeding ground and also the breaking grounds where they took the slaves to break them. So in many cases, when people in America questioned slavery and questioned how many boats and how many slaves came, they failed to realize that many of the slaves were bred once they were brought to the Caribbean, and many of the slaves were bred once they were brought to America. So not all of the slaves came across the ocean. They were babies raised into slavery, bred into slavery. And the Caribbean was a main place for this to happen, all through, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, all over the Virgin Islands, St. Croix, where the Danes were down there doing horrible things to the Maroons to break them. And this went all the way up to Bermuda. Now you must know that Bermuda is not actually a Caribbean island because it's far north, but it might as well have been a Caribbean island because it suffered much of the same colonialism that all of the islands in the Caribbean suffered. And the only reason Bermuda is not a Caribbean island because it's just a bit north. Now, after the Spanish-American War, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained territory of Spain. The rest of the islands ended up being all split up and invaded by various nations, Dutch, French, British, mostly French and British. You had Portuguese coming down there too, but the Portuguese spent most of their energy in the South Pacific, like Hawaii. So this is how the Spanish end up after that war, not being so heavily involved with the Caribbean. But the British and the French really stepped it up and really came in heavily and really were the backbones of a lot of the slavery that was going on down there. Because even though a lot of the indigenous people had died from the diseases the Europeans brought down there, the land was perfect for the sugar cane and the coffee plantations, mainly the sugar cane. So they were down there beating and mistreating the Africans from Africa to get them to work on these sugar cane plantations. And this was all throughout the Caribbean and Bermuda. And it was really horrible. The black people in those areas suffered tremendously. And it was often said that some of the slaves that couldn't be broke, they would not breed them or bring them to the United States. They would leave them down there or just kill them. Now, before the European conquest in the Caribbean, some of the oldest people known in that area were the people in Trinidad, in that area where you had both Carib people and you also had the Arawak real heavy. You also had Arawak all throughout the Caribbean. But Trinidad has some of the oldest findings of these people. And these people flourished all through that area before the Spanish and the British and the French came down, and the Danes came down. The Danes were very brutal, especially in St. Croix and the Virgin Islands, where they had horrible practices that they did to the Maroon people. The Danes were so brutal in St. Croix, and the slave owners were so brutal in the Virgin Islands that you know, if you did something wrong and they forgave you, you had to, you know, lose a leg or ear, or they would brand you on your forehead. You know, it was a horrible situation all throughout the Caribbean. And some of the punishments was unreal, all down in Jamaica, where they would cut the women's stomachs open and the babies would fall out, and they would stomp the babies to death in front of the women and men and other children. And so the situation was extremely brutal in the Caribbean. In many ways, it was more brutal than it was in the United States. So, like for example, in St. Croix, if there was a plot for an uprising or an escape, and you knew something about it, and they found out, they would brand you on your forehead. It was just unbelievably cruel. And many of these people that was involved in that were descendants of the nation of pirates, and this is not historically documented. But pirates roamed the seas in those days and took slaves, even of their own Europeans, to do the rowing. And so you had, when you think about pirates, you think about one ship, but you would have fleets of pirate ships that would just be out doing all type of things. And these were some of the people that were early uh, uh, participants in slavery. And so the brutality that they had towards their own European people, they just continued that on to the people of the Caribbean, the Arawak people, the Maroons, and all the brothers and sisters that was taken from Africa. Now, one reason things got so crazy is because when the Spanish started taking all the gold from South and Central America from the Aztec and the Incas, then other countries in Europe wanted a piece of the action. So you had people coming from the British coming, you had people coming from the Netherlands, and you had people coming from France. So it was just an all-out race to come and steal from the people in South and Central America. And because the Caribbean was in the path, this what developed the slave trade when they realized that they could grow crops there that they couldn't grow in Europe and then ship them back to Europe. This is way before America got in the game. So the originators of the whole slave trade starts with the Spanish. And this is not taught too much in history, but this is a fact. And the black people, the dark people that lived in the Caribbean, indigenous people, and the brothers and sisters that were brought there in slavery suffered the initial brutality of slavery. Now, although the Spanish tried to control the total area at first in the Caribbean, they mostly focused on the larger islands, Cuba, Trinidad, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. This is where they focused mostly and did most of the damage. But like I said earlier, because of the plagues and diseases that killed a lot of people, and because of the war, the Spanish-American War, that depleted the forces from Spain. And then that's when you had a big movement with the French and the British, and later the Americans. There was a lot of action, and the French and the British and the Spanish really concentrated a lot on Bermuda. Bermuda, quiet as it's kept, was one of the main places that they also wanted to come in and dominate because of the beauty of the place and because of the weather and the climate allowed them to force slaves to grow all types of crops, especially spices that they could take to Europe. In those days, spices and gold were some of the main things people traded for. Tobacco, coffee, sugar. These things were very valuable in Europe, where the climate was not suitable to grow these things, especially up in the Netherlands. And when you start talking about the Danes, that were also very upset with the British because the British had, land that was somewhat better for growing, and the Danes were in a very cold, harsh climate. And this is, if you go back and study, you'll see the major war between the Danes and the British were all about this Viking culture trying to get out of the cold and come down to find better places to live in Europe. And the Danes and the Vikings were known for sailing, so were the Spanish. And so these conquests within Europe spread to conquest of places where black people live, including Africa, the Caribbean, and the brown people of South and Central America. So as more nations came in to get a piece of the pie, the Dutch uh, came in, took over places like Saba, Aruba, St. Martin, St. Croix, Puerto Rico, which they called the Dutch West Indies. The French came in and took a lot of places. The British came in. And if you look at the beginning of this video and notice the Caribbean flags, you'll notice the British flag is a part of a lot of the Caribbean islands' flag, just to show how colonialism is still a huge part uh, in that region. What is known as the U.S. West Indies uh, was controlled by Denmark. It was called the Danish West Indies, which was mostly the Virgin Islands. These were the Danes, some of the most brutal uh, people ever, and they brought their brutality from Europe down to the Virgin Islands, especially St. Croix, and lots of horrible things happened to the Maroons on St. Croix during slavery and during that era. So everyone started coming in for a piece of the pie. So you eventually get to the period where, the French and the Spanish got into a big war. And this is when more confusion happens and more places are switched over from one slave owner to another. So this is how the Caribbean end up split up between so many European nations, because these European nations were going to war over that area. And uh, with the development of agriculture down there, they began to take advantage of the slave trade. And so things just went from bad to worse. It went from terrorizing the indigenous people of these islands to bringing in people from Africa and totally brutalizing them to get them to do the free labor, and so that these European countries could become filthy rich by having free labor and not having to pay for labor. So when you look at the wealth of America and Europe, all of that wealth was built on the backbones of destroying people, killing people, and taking their land, and for, decades and decades of free labor. So these nations just brought in lots and lots and lots of slaves. The British brought in like 1,665,000 slaves. The Dutch brought in 500,000 to their areas. And the French brought in like 1,600,000 slaves to the French Indies. So you had the British Indies, the Dutch Indies, and the French Indies, and they were bringing slaves like crazy by the millions, so that they can take advantage of this free labor and use this luscious land to grow. And they had to bring the slaves in because when the Spanish came in, as I said earlier, the indigenous people got sick from the diseases and were dying off in large numbers. And so the land didn't have enough people to work the land, so they brought in Africans to do the work. Now when you get to like the 1800s, the British had the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, like 1807. And so people that were still slaves, that were already slaves, remained slaves. They didn't take any new slaves. And it was like 1830 something before they released the people that were slaves. So this was when some of the slavery eased up with the British uh, Indies, you know. But many of the slave owners, quiet as is kept, didn't abide by those rules. The same in America, that even though slavery was abolished, back off in those areas where nobody could get to, where there's just hundreds and hundreds of acres, there were people in America that were still slaves until the 1970s. And there's a sister called the Slave Doctor. You can go watch documentaries on that. That a lot of the people didn't know slavery was over until they started hearing about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. So you can only imagine just how long people suffered under slavery in the Caribbean and in these farm areas south in the United States. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if people are still in slavery in many of these places. So in Europe, sugar was a luxury before the 18th century. And after so many people were abused and forced to work in the Caribbean, in the sugarcane fields, then sugar slowly became a necessity in Europe from so much of this free labor and so much of these goods. They're basically stolen because the people are stolen, forced to work. They're not paid, and so everything you harvested was stolen. So when you look at these huge sugar companies, they owe the people in the Caribbean and the black people in the United States, they owe them reparation for the sugar that built these companies. And this is a major problem in the world, that many banks and many companies that grow coffee and tobacco and sugar and cotton, many of these industries never paid the money back that they got from this free labor. And so a lot of the families in the Caribbean and in the United States are on billions of dollars in revenues for free labor that was forced upon their ancestors. So many of the brothers and sisters in the Caribbean suffered for a long time. Haiti was the first ones to break away by 1804, Haiti had finally won their war and become independent. But places like Jamaica and Trinidad didn't get their independence until 1962. And so just look at all that time from the 1400s, people being down there, till the 1900s of just brutality. And so even still today, all through the Caribbean and all up in Bermuda, you can see the effects of colonialism in a white-dominated society upon the indigenous Arawak people and the African people that were brought there as slaves. And the police departments for a long time were brutal and all white. And the system in the Caribbean was set up to keep the black people down and to keep them oppressed. And so when you start getting to the Black Power era in the United States, this started to spread through the Caribbean. So, and some other islands like Bermuda. And so Bermuda was paying attention to what was going on with black people in America. And they began to rise up in the 70s. And you had a group called the Black Beret. And the Black Beret were basically some Black Panthers in Bermuda that was fighting against the white oppression that was going on the island. And so it's been a long fight for people to rise up. And the system is still not balanced correctly all through the Caribbean, Bermuda, Jamaica, Trinidad, all over. There's gang violence because the power is not quite balanced. And what European nations have done is, instead of openly controlling these islands under the leadership of a country, they've switched their game to controlling it through tourism. And so they're heavily invested into tourism, where they control these various islands. If it's controlled by the French, it's set up for the French people to go there for vacation. If it's controlled by the British, it's set up for the British people to go there for vacation. If it's controlled by the Dutch, it's set up for the Dutch to go there on vacation. And so now the Caribbean islands are controlled through these luxury hotels that are set up really nice on one part of the islands, while the people back in the rural black communities suffer and live nowhere near how they should live. So you can go to a place like Jamaica and you can go to some of the nicest resorts in the world, but then turn around and still have shanty towns and poverty and gang war over economic struggles. So the game in the Caribbean has been flipped, and tourism is now the new forms of exploitation. It's done as far as Hawaii the same way. You know, you can go to Hawaii and you can see the effects of tourism. And on these islands in the Caribbean, the main law that the police uphold is to protect the tourists. They don't protect the citizens. They protect the tourism money and the investment that these Europeans have invested into these islands. So there's a huge imbalance all throughout the Caribbean and in Bermuda, where the people are still under oppression and still under colonialism, but is done through these fancy airlines and these fancy hotels. If you go to the Caribbean, you will notice these rich people that sail their boats down there and dock their boats and live off the boats and live off of the beauty of the island while the people suffer. And the people have to a lot of times have their little booths or whatever and hustle to sell whatever type of novelties they could sell to the tourists. From the Caribbean all to the South Pacific, these places are set up like zoos where you can go, go see the people in the Virgin Island. Oh, go see the people in Jamaica. Go see the Rastas. Go see the reggae. Go to Trinidad, see the people. So they have people there that to make a living are a part of the exploitation. You know, I was watching a commercial, and I'm not going to say from who, but it was one of these tourists where you go on cruises. And the commercial they had for the cruise, it showed all Europeans and whites on the vacation. And it showed all black people in the Caribbean as servants, opening the doors, bringing you a drink, okay, servicing you. And so they have the black people on these Caribbean islands as servicers. You just service the Europeans. And the Europeans come and live the wonderful life of a rich person or a successful person. And the black people are portrayed as nothing but servants. And this is modern day colonialism still going on all throughout the Caribbean and even here in the United States. And it's disgusting. Now, of course, I have solutions, and this is to all the black and brown people throughout the Caribbean. You all's solution is to break away from whatever country is claiming you and to become one nation. Okay? You must do something new. From Bermuda all the way down, all of your islands, you should become an island nation, one island nation under one island flag. And you all, politicians should all work together like a United Nations or like a Congress or a Senate to do what's best for all of your Caribbean islands and exclude European countries from your business and take control. An economic revolution. You'll never be able to get free being a separate Trinidad, a separate Bermuda, a separate Bahama, a separate Jamaica, a separate Virgin Islands. You don't have a chance. You all must unite and come up with a new name and be basically a country of islands, right? Become a unified country, okay? Even though Bermuda's not in the Caribbean, include them and include all the islands and say, we are now a country. We reject being called British Virgin Islands or U.S. Virgin Islands or, you know, anybody's Virgin Islands or anybody's Caribbean island. We reject that. We are now one united country of islands that are going to look out for the benefit of our own people We're going to control our own tourism. If the big hotels and stuff want to leave, fine. Take control of your resources and build your own hotels. Build your own casinos and your own restaurants that's going to benefit the people there, okay? And unite your police departments and your military. So now you can have some control over the gang situations, because people have exploited the division amongst you and used your islands to also run drugs from South and Central America, and use your island as holdover posts for the drugs. And because of that, drug addiction has also swept through the Caribbean islands and Bermuda, because so many drugs have been coming through there. So many drugs float up on the coast and up on those islands out there. They float up on the coast of South and Central America. Anybody from Belize could tell you anytime kilos of cocaine might just float up on the shore. So the same in the Caribbean. And so the only hope for the Caribbean and Bermuda is to unite as one nation of islands, and for you all to start electing rulers that want to do that. If you have someone that is the prime minister of your island that does not want to unite with all the other prime ministers of the other island, don't vote them in. Because no island can go against a nation. No island can go against France. No little island can go against America. No little island can go against the Dutch or the British. But together, you can go against them and take your power and your clout and start working with black people from Africa that should also unite, and working with black people in America and create a black tourist industry. If whites want to come, fine. But it's time for us to do for ourselves. So start catering to African Americans that's making money to come to your island. Start setting up your own cruises, buying your own ships, where you have cruises that could take you to every island. And you can go pick the islands you want to go to on a cruise, and it's all in-house. None of the money's going to the British. None of the money's going to the Dutch and the French, to the Hyatt Regency, and to these hotels that have no interest in putting any money back into your island. They're taking the money out and they're sending it to their countries where their family is, and they're creating generational wealth for the people of the Hilton hotels and the Hyatt Regency hotels and these fancy hotels. It's not for your benefit. It all starts with leadership. The leadership in these countries in Africa, the leadership on these islands all through the Caribbean and Bermuda must start getting on one accord if you want to be able to take care of your people. Or you're going to look up and you're going to always still have crime. You're going to always still have gang wars. You're going to always still have poverty on places that are bringing in billions of dollars that is just going right back off of your island and is not benefiting the people there on the island. And you'll never be able to benefit each other until you unite. There's no reason that the Virgin Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Croix, St. Kitts, St. Martinique, Bermuda, the Bahamas, there's no reason that you all are not united as one country of islands. This is your only solution. This is what you must do. You must unite. You all got to stop with the tribal war. You're doing the same thing they're doing in Africa. You're making the same mistakes that we're making here in America with our gang problem. Too much tribal war when all of the tribes are still losing. Yeah, you Trini against the JA, yeah, you VI posse against the Trini, against the JA, but nobody likes the VI posse, nobody likes the Trinis, and nobody likes the JA posse from these other countries. And so you can't hate each other when other people hate you too. It's time for Jamaicans and Trinidadians to be like this. Virgin Island brethren like this. Okay? It's time for you all to unite. Or you're going to look up and you're going to have a new colonizer. And China's going to come in and buy you out. Look at Jamaica. Jamaica's being totally sold to the Chinese. There's no need to sell the island to the Chinese when you have so much beauty that people want to see, and you can take control of your own destiny and make that major money off of tourism. So you black people all throughout the Caribbean, unite and take over the black Caribbean, including Bermuda, take over that tourist industry and take care of your people in your islands. And I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will be back for more, but it's a lot to cover. So stay together, unite, big up yourself, and remember, one God, one aim, and one destiny.